Hey everybody, it is late at night and I am Norman. It is time once again to see what's happening in the world of watches. So let us begin. The first story that I'm covering comes to us from Hodinkee.com. And this is an article about the Knives Out watch, which happens to be the Omega Seamaster 1948. We can see a couple shots of Daniel Craig wearing this watch and it looks absolutely amazing on him. I saw the first Knives Out and I'm really excited to see the second one. I love whodunit movies. So cool. And I like this watch a lot. If you pull it up, the dial is just brilliant. It comes in at 38 millimeters. So what do I think of this watch? It kind of makes me sad because I feel like it's a little bit chunky, and I feel like that's the case with nearly every contemporary watch. So the dial is nice and classy, a little bit vintagey, but when you look at the case, it doesn't have the elegance that you see in vintage watches. For instance, if we're looking at my Wittenauer watch, you can see how sleek and small, not in diameter, but just in overall. The lugs aren't huge and chunky, the case isn't either, it's nice and sleek, and even more so with the Juvenia watch. I mean, just look at that. It is just sleek and slim, and I feel like contemporary watches are just kind of chunky. But the watch does look absolutely brilliant on Craig. I feel like if the case had some more elegance to it, maybe a bit more curve to it, to kind of make it look thinner, and less chunky lugs, maybe lugs that kind of curve in from the case a little bit, I think if that were the case, this watch would be next level. I think that it would be great to see some of the sensibilities of vintage watches, even if we don't see the size, which of course would be my preference. I have gone little. But yeah, just some of the sensibilities, the sleekness and slimness of the cases would be great to see in contemporary watches. Well, in more contemporary watches. There are examples out there. I mean, there is the Orion. You can see it has a nice, slim, sleek case. So that's a contemporary watch that has the sensibilities of a vintage piece. Same with the Max Bill, which itself is designed after vintage pieces, so it makes sense. But other than its chunkiness, I really love this watch. The next story comes from Deployant.com. And guess what? It is 50 Fathoms Year. So in 1953, the 50 Fathoms came out. And apparently it was the first modern dive watch. You gotta love the 50 Fathoms. So keep your eyes on Blancpain this year, because they're gonna be celebrating the 50 Fathoms, I believe, throughout the year. What do I think of this? I too will be watching Blancpain, because I want to see what they do. This will be interesting. And happy birthday to the 50 Fathoms. So yeah, that means the 50 Fathoms is 70. Cool. The next article comes from iwmagazine.com, and apparently Oris has come out with a 3D printed watch. Whoa, that's cool. So Oris teamed up with Canadian aerial firefighters Coulson Aviation to create the Coulson limited edition watch. They're making 1,000 of these watches at a price range of around $4,000. What do I think of these watches? I think it's awesome. If I could have a 3D printer and print off watch cases and whatever else, that would be pretty cool. And it's cool to see this technology used by a brand like Oris. And these watches are really great looking. And they come in a bunch of different colorways, which is fun. I think it's cool when watch brands try new, interesting things, and this is definitely that. So kudos to Oris for a 3D printed watch. So cool. If I remember right, they're pretty large though. They might be 42 millimeters. I would have to double check that. But cool idea. Alright, this next article comes from Monochrome Watches, and this was an interesting one. This was completely new to me. They did an article discussing the difference between a collar or desktop GMT and a Traveller's GMT. I had no idea there was such a distinction. Okay, so here's the difference. With the collar GMT, when you're setting the time, it's the second time zone hour hand that you can move hour by hour. However, in most cases, you can only move it one direction because that crown position also sets the date. So yeah, you can only move it in one direction. And it's not the local time that you're setting, it's the second time zone. So if you have to set the local time, that GMT hand moves right along with the local, the primary hour and minutes hand. So you'd have to set it back once you're done again. In contrast, the Traveller's GMT has a similar setup, except that it's the local hour hand that you can move, and you can typically set it in both directions. Now, they didn't explain how you deal with the date in this case. With the collar GMT, the date setting shares the same crown position as the second time zone hour hand. But I'm not sure with the traveling one, because you can set the local hour in both directions. Maybe most of these pieces have a secondary crown if they have a date window at all. But these GMTs definitely make it easier for travelers to keep their current time set correctly. So when you cross over to a different time zone, you can quickly set the local time just by moving that hour hand a notch or two in whatever direction you need. And I believe with a lot of Traveller GMTs, the secondary time zone hand is a 24-hour hand. I may have to do a more in-depth video. I actually don't know a ton about GMTs. But this was definitely good to know. I had absolutely no idea. I thought a GMT was a GMT, but apparently not. Thank you, monochrome watches. The last article I have comes from Trilobe Watches, and this was a review of the Trilobe Watch. So this watch has rings with number indices on them that tell the time. It has a gigantic domed crystal over it. It reminds me of Jacob & Co. and similar pieces to that, although at a fraction of their cost. So what are my thoughts on this watch? When I first encountered the watch, the only photos I saw of it were from one angle, and I had no idea that the rings were actually offset. I thought they were right in the center of the watch. But they're not, they're offset down toward the 8 o'clock or so. There's a little red pointer that lets you know what the current time is, so the rings that align with that red pointer are the time. This watch is pretty crazy looking. I like the creativity of it, the rings look great, and you can kind of see the movement through parts of the dial. There's actually a lot going on the front of this watch, and that crystal is really fun. I love me some super domed crystals or super high box crystals. They're just fun. Now this is a super limited edition watch. There's only 25 of them being made, and they're being sold at $22,000. So I'm not sure why even tell us about it. It's not like any of us will ever see this watch except in pictures. So enjoy the pictures because that's about all we're gonna get. Man, super ultra limited editions are just crazy. 25 pieces, that's nuts. I'm really not a huge fan of limited edition watches. Even when a brand makes a decent amount, couple thousand or something, man, that's rough. But this watch is very creative, I'll give it that. I kind of like its aesthetics, even though they're crazy and Jacob & Co. style. So, I kind of like it. Well, that will do it for this edition of What's Happening in the Watch World. Thanks for watching.